you're right. Okay. Maybe I'll let you. Okay. Okay, I declare open this public hearing of the Senate Environment Communications Legislation Committee in relation to its inquiry into the provisions of the Communication Legislation Amendment, SBS Advertising Flexibility and Other Measures Bill 2005. I welcome you here today. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of proceedings is being made. Before the committee starts taking evidence, I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. The committee prefers all evidence to be given in public, but under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to request to be heard in private session. It is important that the witnesses give the committee notice if they intend to ask to give evidence in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the grounds upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the grounds which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may, of course, also be made at any other time. I'd also ask witnesses if you could remain behind for a couple of minutes after the conclusion in case the Hansard staff need clarification on any terms of reference. Remind anybody who mobile phones, as is mine, make sure that there is a switch to silent or turned off. And on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you for your submission and for being here today and your cooperation. So I now welcome representatives of the Federation of the Ethnic Communities Council of Australia. Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. The committee has your submission. Would you like to make any amendments or changes to that submission?
We did actually provide
an addendum.
An addendum.
Okay, yes, we have that.
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to make any opening remarks before we begin? When you first speak, if you could just say your name and the capacity in which you are appearing here today, and please feel free to start your opening remarks.
Sure. My name is Eugenia Grammatikakis. I'm the Senior Deputy Chair of Fecca with my fellow Senior Deputy Chair Tina Karanastassis, and we thank you for inviting Fecca to this hearing. Fecca is the peak national body representing Australians from CAL backgrounds, and our primary aim is to provide advocacy, develop policy and promote issues to government and the broader community on behalf of its constituency. Our membership comprises of state, territory and regional multicultural and ethnic councils, and we have an elected executive committee and a professional secretariat that implements our policies and work programs. As outlined in our submission and the addendum that we also provided qualifying further our position, Fecca supports the bill that provides SBS with the flexibility in scheduling, advertising and sponsorship announcements in its broadcasting. We also like to highlight some of the key issues that we dealt with in arriving to that position. Fecca has had a very strong association with SBS over the years since its inception, and we have passionately advocated over the years for the ongoing government support of SBS. We believe it is a unique service and it serves well the multicultural and multilingual community of Australia. The support has been a grassroots support. Communities at the grassroots level over the years have supported SBS as a unique broadcaster, and we have found ourselves in a conflicting position. We found ourselves between a rock and a hard place given the current situation. On principle, Fecca would not wish to see increase in advertising on SBS. However, we are concerned that if the bill would pass or would not pass, but also we believe if it does pass, this could mean cuts to programs, to services, and to opportunities to invest in additional initiatives that we believe could benefit our multicultural and multilingual Australia community. Fecca, and that this has been a position all along, has repeatedly called on the government to reinstate the funding. However, we feel that given the current economic situation in Australia, we feel that that funding will not be restored to SBS. And being mindful of this and also of the danger that SBS could be compromised in its capacity to be able to continue to provide quality programming for multicultural Australia, we see this position as a compromise position, and we believe that, as I indicated, it hasn't been an easy position to reach. And notwithstanding this, we are equally cognizant of the risks that that increasing in advertising during peak hour could present SBS, and this is why we strongly advocate at the same time that there be safeguards put in place and guidelines that reassure the audience and other stakeholders of SBS that the integrity of the Charter and of its programming would not be compromise. We believe there needs to be, given the current situation, a compromise or a balance found to address the potential risks or the funding cuts may present to SBS, and we believe that the bill is that compromise, and it provides, in our view, flexibility for SBS to be able to increase revenue and continue to provide quality service for multicultural and multilingual Australia. So,
thank you. Would you like to add anything to that?
No, just to reiterate the statement that Eugenia made, that Fecca did not come to this position easily. Given our history, given the fact that we've always been there with Fecca, with SBS since its inception. Fecca feels very passionately about SBS and its contribution to promoting social cohesion within our Australian community, and we don't want to see that sort of standard and that position jeopardised in any way. We do caution against that slippery slope in terms of if this amendment is passed and if that flexibility is allowed to SBS, we would hate to see it erode even further into the future. So we do see that there's potential there for a slippery slope, and we're very concerned about it. And of course, Fecca will be monitoring it very carefully.
Before I hand over to my colleagues, just take you to the actual details of the relationship that you have with SBS. You alluded to you've had a very close working relationship with SBS for quite a period of time. I mean, what are the actual activities that you undertake? What do you have any formal relationship with SBS? Do you consult to them? Do you provide them with information in terms of what your members would like to see in terms of the content that's provided on their channels? I mean, what actually is the relationship with SBS?
Well, there isn't as such a formal relationship in that we have MOUs in place or anything of that nature. It's been over the 40 years or so has developed. I mean, there is the leadership or the executive of Fecca and other members do have contact with at the state level and also at a federal level through, we don't have as such regular meetings, if you like, or set meetings, but when there are opportunities for us to feed information about what the views of our communities are or our constituents are, if there are issues around the need, for example, for new communities to have access to a language program, as had happened last year when they were reviewing the language the radio language programs. We provided feedback at that point about what the views of our communities, particularly new communities, were. So, and at other instances when our communities or our constituents raise issues that relate to programming, they're not happy with things or they wish to see other things, programs increase, or other communities that do not have access to a language program or other services we bring that to their attention. So it is sort of an informal, ongoing and organic, if you like, relationship.
And
from my point.
You'd say that it's been a good working relationship over that period?
Well, over that period of time, we've always, though, been upfront and critical when there was a need to be critical. If there were views of our constituents that they were not happy with things, we would always raise those issues. But equally, if there was something that was positive and good, we would always provide feedback that encouraged SBS to continue to develop in ways that are of benefit to multilingual and multicultural Australia.
And just finally, you made the comment about that Fecca wouldn't like to see an increase in advertising on SBS. I suppose just to sort of acknowledge the fact that this isn't actually an increase, so that this bill doesn't propose any increase in advertising. It's merely just giving the SBS some greater level of flexibility as to where they place their ads. So, I mean, obviously you acknowledge that fact? Yes.
Of course, yes.
Okay, yep. Okay. Thank you. Senator Urquhart?
Thank you very much. Good morning. I just want to take you back prior to the last election when the Prime Minister said that there would be no cuts to SBS, along with other things. Were you heartened by that statement? Well, of course, Fecca would be heartened by anything that retains the status quo of funding for SBS, and that's why we did in fact qualify in our introduction that, our in principle, our primary position, our preference would be not to even have to deal with this issue. Our preference would be that funding be restored to SBS, or at least that it be funded at a level which allows it viability to do the things that it needs to do to effectively and successfully fulfil the requirements of its charter. So, any position that reinforces that we would welcome. Do you think that the cuts to SBS are necessary?
Well, we believe, we don't work as such for SBS, so we don't know the internal management but in terms of
the changes, do you think that they're necessary?
We believe, and we have advocated for the funding to be retained. We believe that SBS, from observation, doesn't receive a huge amount of funding compared, say, to ABC. It's a relatively moderate funding, in our view, and we believe that with that funding that SBS manages to provide radio and television services to multicultural Australia. So we would say no. We wouldn't have liked to have seen that funding to have been taken away from SBS, but also at the same time we do acknowledge the economic situation that Australia is in, and the government has to have a budget, and as part of that we understand that some cuts have been made across the board, and SBS, as with other entities, have received cuts, but our preference would have been no, because we believe that SBS is moderately funded, and we believe that funding, in our view, from observation, is used wisely.
Did your organisation have any consultation with the Minister or any of his representatives about this bill?
No.
So when did you first become aware of the changes?
Well, Fecca has received, that is the office, information. I mean, we linked to government departments, and so the office does receive information about any bills, any inquiries that might automatically that comes to the office. So that's how we became aware, and also through Fecca is represented on the Community Advisory Committee through myself of SBS, so it had been flagged via email to the membership of the CAC that these changes are happening, including the cuts and so on. But there were no formal meetings.
So there were no consultations to see how these changes might actually affect the organisation or the communities that you represent?
Well, we consulted with our communities.
Yeah, you consulted with your community.
And hence,
but there was no consultation from the Minister's office.
To our knowledge and the advice that we have received from our office, there haven't been any formal meetings or consultations.
Great. So, what is your understanding of what the government plans to do if this bill doesn't pass?
Well, my understanding is that if the bill does not pass, the funding cuts would still be upheld.
Okay, so there would be further funding cuts.
Well, the cuts that have been announced, and certainly we will be concerned if down the track there are further cuts to be made, and we certainly would be strongly advocating against that as we have in the past.
Do you think that it's an ethical approach for the government to take hold on SBS funding to ransom on passing of the bill, given the pre-election promise that was made prior to the election about no cuts?
Sorry, what was? Can you?
So, do you think that the organisation's being held to ransom because there were promises made prior to the election that there would be no cuts? Now, if the bill doesn't pass, then the cuts will occur. I think that's, as I understand, is your understanding of it. I mean, is this just another cut by another name?
I won't comment on that.
Okay. Would you advocate for this bill if the government hadn't broken its promise that there'd be no cuts to SBS?
Well, we consistently have advocated that there'll be no cuts to SBS, and we're on record in the past of doing so.
You consistently said.
We have been consistent in that.
Okay.
But as we...
So I understand that the Lewis Review acknowledged that increased advertising would result in risk to the amount of the charter-related content. What impacts could this have on SBS's ability to meet its charter?
Well, again, we have strongly advocated that any cuts that are made and that they do not impact on compromising the charter of SBS. So we will still strongly advocate that the charter be maintained, and that's why we equally have advocated that whilst there may be cuts or changes in programs, that the charter be maintained, and also that safeguards be put in place and guidelines that reassure the audience and other stakeholders that the charter would be maintained and the programming, the integrity of the charter and the programming be maintained. So we would be concerned, very concerned, if the charter is compromised, and we would strongly advocate, as we have, that safeguards put in place, if they're already there, to be reinforced and ensure that the integrity of the charter is maintained.
So if this bill doesn't pass and there are cuts, do you think the integrity of the charter is in question?
Well, that's speculative. I don't know. But we will strongly advocate that the cuts should not compromise.
But do you think there could be an effect to the charter? I mean, obviously you'd say that you'd be advocating that there shouldn't be, but if there's further funding, do you think that might impact on the charter?
Added in our submission that there could be risks that the organisation may face because of the cuts that perhaps could compromise the way it does business, the quality of its programming and of its charter. So that's why we raised those concerns in our submission, and we advocate that that should not happen, and hence guidelines and other safeguards be in place to reassure the public and the audience in particular of SBS that...
Yeah, no, I picked that up on page 28 of your report, of your submission. That's why I've raised it. So, Save Our SBS contends that 94% of SBS viewers want in-program ad breaks removed, not increased. What concerns have your constituents raised with you about this bill in relation to that?
Well, as we indicated in our submission, which has been informed through consultation from our constituents, their preference, of course, and ours would be that there will be no increase. But given the situation that SBS is faced with, we believe that this is a compromise, and they, as we indicate...
I understand all that.
Yeah.
The question was what concerns, because I understand it's in your submission, but I would like to get it on the record. So what are the concerns that your constituents have actually raised about the bill if that changes?
One potential concern might be the impact on the viewer. As we've seen with commercial television, you insert, and they advertise a lot more extensively than what's being proposed here. The impact on the viewer, very often people will literally walk away from their television sets if they're constantly bombarded with advertisements. So that's certainly been one of our concerns. What will the impact on the viewer be? Because SBS, the beauty of SBS and what makes it so unique, and the fact that it did grow out of a community groundswell of advocacy and grassroots activity, is a very strong, initially what began as a very strong affiliation with the multicultural community sector. I mean, the beauty of SBS is that it's now been embraced by all sectors of the Australian community, so that's certainly one of its strengths. We'd like to see SBS maintain that viewer loyalty, and of course one of our concerns is that, you know, there may be potential impacts on viewers.
Yeah. Okay.
And the other issue also that has been raised as a concern is the potential of advertisers and influencing of advertisers that could also compromise. So that is another concern that has been raised within this context.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by influence of advertisers?
Well, influencing the programming, or that in where there would be where advertising will be happening. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So impacting on when programs happen and that sort of thing. Yeah. So in your submission, you referred to SBS's role in modern Australia, where we face growing tensions in a number of communities, and that there is a growing threat of terrorism. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by that in your submission?
Well, again, one of the great strengths of SBS is that all sectors of the Australian community see themselves reflected in SBS programming, in what SBS offers the community. We see our faces, we see our names, we see ourselves reflected. And again, that's what makes SBS so incredibly unique and special. The other thing about SBS is that it's not feared to go where angels often fear to tread. So it's often dealt with issues around racism, around the disenfranchisement of young people from Muslim communities. It's dealt with topics that, you know, commercial television just, won't touch. So again, we see ourselves reflected, we see the tensions in our community reflected. There's no backing away from the really challenging and difficult topics that face all of you and face ourselves as members of the community. So, I think there's kind of a general agreement really that the only way we're going to address some of these really sort of challenging issues in our community is to do it at different levels, and the media has tremendous potential to reach those in the community that often policymakers and organisations like ourselves often can't reach. They're hard to reach. So we see that SBS has a tremendous contribution to make, and again, one of our concerns is that with continual funding cuts, even that aspect of its operations may be compromised or impacted upon. And again, when we talk about safeguards, that's one of the safeguards that we would like to see in place. I mean, these issues are becoming very important to the cohesion of our community. We can't shy away from them. Very often there's this tendency to want to bury them, to not want to believe that these things are happening in our community. And the beauty of SBS is that it's never shied away from them. And, in that respect, we do work closely with SBS to raise awareness and to diffuse conflict and to promote the importance of multi-faith, multicultural communities and its strengths. So, we certainly feel that SBS is a leading light in this regard, and we would hate to see that aspect of its programming compromised in any way.
Okay, thanks. Just got one more, Chair. Ms. Grammatikakis, you talked about cuts to programming and services in your opening statement. Are you concerned that commercial realities may influence programming decisions to a greater degree if the bill passed? I mean, you just talked about advertisers having influence over when programs. Is that the main issue, or are there others?
That is the main concern that has been raised. So we would caution that does not happen.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Chair.
Are you aware whether other governments around the world actually have the same sort of hybrid models that of part advertising, public funding, as occurs with SBS?
I've heard. Sorry, Virginia.
No,
go ahead.
you go.
I've heard similar things out of Canada, but to my knowledge, Canada's the only other country that has a similar kind of. I don't know a lot about it, but that's my understanding.
Because just in terms of a number of the things that you've just raised, things like the integrity of the charter. I mean, you've been having advertising. The SBS has been having advertising since 1998. And there's been no question as to the integrity and the delivery of the charter since then. I just thought possibly it may be worthwhile to satisfy yourselves that the concerns that you're raising possibly aren't, well, not that they're not, the concerns aren't founded, but you may alleviate your concerns if you had a look at some of the models that possibly are in other places around the world where they do have this hybrid model. That still works perfectly well without the integrity of the charter or the influence of advertisers and the like, having the impact that you raise as a concern. So, Senator Ludlam?
I've just got a couple by way of follow-up. Do you think there's a tension between the obligations that the station or that the broadcaster has under its charter and the obligations of serving a commercial audience and trying to reach for mainstream appeal as it chases ratings?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. No, I would not answer.
I do believe the viewing public has a sense of when there's a departure, when things change, especially if they've been part of that viewing constituency for a very long time, as our constituents have. They do detect changes. They do, they can actually see when there is a departure, perhaps from what SBS was originally designed to do. The fact that SBS continues to retain its very strong grassroots support is important to us as an advocacy body. And I think, look, what's the old saying about the one constant in life is change? I think our constituency understand that. I think they understand the economic realities in which we live. And we as an advocacy body have a responsibility to make sure that when we advocate in an informed, responsible way. And as Eugenia reiterated earlier, I mean, for us, this has been a very challenging, difficult issue to come to grips with, given that we've always maintained a very solid position on this and continue to do so. But I think, in answer to your question, Senator, I really do believe that the viewing public ultimately wants good quality programming. It wants to continue to see itself reflected in that programming. That's the attraction of SBS. And the fact that they still continue to support SBS so strongly suggests that there's still achieving that level of satisfaction. But again, it's about, we have a responsibility to ensure, as does the government, that we continue to maintain that level of satisfaction and that level of integrity in its programming, and that's ultimately what we're most concerned about.
Yeah, well, I certainly share that concern. You said it was a difficult process that you've come to reach. I guess I would characterise as reluctant support for the bill. If the cuts have to happen, you disagree with them, but if they do have to happen, then this is one way of maintaining funding base for the broadcaster. And you've said you're very concerned that the station, if the bill doesn't pass, and it's looking increasingly unlikely that it will, that the broadcaster may be forced to cut services and specialised programming and content. So recognising that concern. But I want to bring you to the risk that I see, and I suspect many others see as well, that in chasing advertising revenues, in chasing product placement within programming and chasing ratings, that broadcasters already cutting services and specialised programming for precisely that reason, and that there is, if anything, a greater risk as you increasingly commercialise and the broadcaster just basically chases the advertising dollar, that we're already seeing leaks from within the broadcaster. Don't run Ebola stories on your nightly news, it turns people off. Don't run stuff from the Middle East, don't run stuff from wherever. Do you recognise that is a risk as well as the broadcaster increasingly starts to look like a mainstream commercial broadcaster?
We believe there are numerous risks, and that's why we've made such a strong statement in terms of safeguards being in place to ensure that doesn't happen, especially when there are issues like the ones you've raised, which actually impact on the health and well-being of the Australian community. So those safeguards have to be in place. Fecca is represented on the Community Stakeholder Committee of SBS, and we take that role very seriously, and we'll be monitoring that in our fullest capacity. But yes, look, the minute there are potential risks. Maybe some imagined, some real. I mean, obviously we're very anxious about what these changes might bring. And we'll be monitoring the situation very carefully. But of course, there's always potential risks, and that's why there has to be a commitment that there will also be safeguards put in place to minimise those risks.
Can you tell us what you mean by safeguards? I don't actually see any. I see the broadcaster heading in a particular direction without many safeguards. In a way, I think that's why we're seeing so many leaks and people trying to express their concerns and alarm from within the broadcaster itself. So what do you speak of when you speak of safeguards?
Well, again, we're not experts in broadcasting, but certainly there needs to be those safeguards. The importance of those safeguards need to be recognised at different levels.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what safeguards you mean. What do you mean?
Itself is a safeguard, I would think, and that needs to be upheld. Also, I think a commitment, that there is a commitment from respective boards of SBS that that charter is maintained and that they would not compromise irrespective of going down the path of advertising, that they would ensure that will give a commitment, and that will be part of the terms of reference, I would say, of the board, that they would not allow that commercialisation or SBS to go down that path. I'm sure that there are currently, the charter itself is something that guides the organisation, I would think, and that needs to be upheld. And the board being committed to not to allow the flexibility that it wants to allow to enable SBS to increase its revenue, but not to commercialise it. Again, I'm not an expert either, so I don't know, but I just sense that there are commitments that the government and that could put in place, like KPI, that they have to be upheld by the board and the management. So
I I guess I'd put it to you that what this bill does is precisely the opposite. That's why we're very concerned about it, that it forces the station to further commercialise. And, particularly by loading a lot more of its advertising into premium primetime spots, that you're going to see programming change very dramatically to suit what advertisers want. Otherwise, they won't be able to get the advertisers in. So I guess my concern is that the station is already in breach of its charter in quite serious and profound ways, that it's not a slippery slope that we need to be cautious against. We are already well down it. So I'd be interested in any advice you can provide us for how you think we can most effectively hold the broadcaster to its charter in this environment that it's being forced into.
Well, we'll be very happy to provide further input to the committee on that and give you some of our thoughts on how that could be done.
That's greatly appreciated. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Dennis?
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. And I just want to follow up what Senator Ludlam just raised, because I think it's an important point about when you have public broadcasters like this, how as a community you hold them to account. Now, in the case of SBS, it does have a charter, as you said, which sets out certain requirements. You're concerned in the current context about the balance between raising more revenue and how that impacts on the discharge of those charter obligations. But as an organisation, you mentioned earlier that you have some input through being part of some stakeholder forum or whatever that SBS have. But in practice, how much influence do outside organisations have over how SBS discharges its charter obligations? Or is it essentially a matter for the board and the management to interpret those obligations and discharge them? I mean, how can you influence them?
Well, being on the committee that you refer to is a community advisory committee that is representative of the community, and Fecca does have a position. We have a position on that. So that's one way or one vehicle through which community concerns can be raised. At the end of the day, we understand that the board ultimately would take the concerns and the advice, but we believe that vehicle should be utilised as effectively as possible. Other ways, I mean, is for communities through bodies like Fecca and other interested entities to actively continue to advocate, to meet with relevant ministers or committees such as this when they do happen, or through other being active and consistently advocating and monitoring what is happening. At the end of the day, you can advocate, you can raise issues to all these relevant bodies that are there in vehicles, but we also understand that at the end of the day, the final decisions are made by the boards or by the government, but I believe that there are vehicles there that can be done and keep, monitor.
Are you aware of any research that's been done over time about how the SBS is meeting its obligations? I'm not talking about the SBS telling us how it's meeting its obligations.
Yes.
More independent research?
To my knowledge, no. I'm not aware. I don't know, Tina, if...
Well, only the 2014 research that was done on both cost efficiencies around SBS and the ABC. Mm-hmm. Again, we're guided very much by, and we can sort of take that point on notice, because while Eugenia and I may not be aware, our Secretariat may be aware, so we can certainly, provide you with additional information. But again, we're guided by our constituency. I mean, Fecca has over 1,000 organisations that make up its constituency. We rely on their guidance, their feedback, their input, and it's very much a two-way kind of process. We work through our state constituencies. When issues have become contentious, or we feel, if at any time we felt that we weren't getting an appropriate hearing through SBS itself, we would obviously make direct representation to the Minister and nurture that relationship. And I guess also our hope is that the government, in affecting these changes, would be also setting up some kind of independent review and evaluation process that sits outside of SBS but involves SBS, so that 12 months down the track or 2 years down the track, some of the concerns that we've raised, there'll be greater clarity around how things are working. I mean, has the charter been compromised? Do we need to review the way that business is being enacted within SBS? So again, obviously SBS would need to be closely involved with that. So again, it's also about having in place within government, if there is that commitment to quality programming and the charter not being compromised in any way, one would hope that the government is also setting up sort of an independent kind of review and evaluation mechanism by which we can truly measure the impacts of those changes.
Because I have a non-English speaking background, I might be predisposed to want to watch SBS, and I have ever since I was a child, and it's been a great experience. The dilemma always is, for a specific broadcaster like that, how does it appeal to the broader community? Because what you were alluding to earlier was the educative function of the SBS in helping to promote greater multicultural, multilingual understanding and sort of cross-cultural understanding, for want of a better description, okay? So in this context, and this was not meant to be a leading question, but in a sense it is, unless SBS is trying to broaden its appeal to the broader community, how does it get people in so it can then also seek to influence their attitudes around these cultural and linguistic issues that we referred to earlier?
Sorry, Eugenie, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think as part of its role, and I'm sure they're doing it at the moment, is that the community engagement that needs to be central also to the services that they provide, and try to engage and with as broad a section of the community as is possible, and draw input into their programming and other activities. So I think a significant element of that role is that the community engagement and meaningful engagement with various stakeholders, perhaps the core audience that may often be seen, those from multicultural or cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds, but also the broader Australian community that also, supports SBS. So a strong community engagement component of the service should be there and strengthened, I think.
I guess the point I'm getting at, though, is if to some extent the SBS is able, through these mechanisms, to actually increase its audience reach, which gives it a capacity to perhaps engage people who might not otherwise in the normal course have watched SBS, and does that then lead? Because there's no point people who watch SBS talking to themselves. The important thing is reaching out to those Australians who have different attitudes that we are seeking to influence.
But increasing advertising won't achieve that. I mean, it still comes back to intelligent quality programming. People in the community aren't silly. They know what they like. They know what appeals to them. And they'll always be drawn to programming that touches them, that is intelligent, that draws them in. Assuming that there's proper promotion and publicity that goes with that. But the reason we've seen non-cold or non-English speaking background people, broader members of the community attracted to SBS is because of the nature of that programming and the fact that, it often presents them with a viewpoint that they hadn't considered before. And I think people in our community know what they like and know what they're drawn to. And it's one of the reasons, and I don't mean to be critical of commercial television, but I know personally as a viewer, I'm starting to kind of switch off between the level of advertising and the quality of programming. There are times when I sit there desperately wanting to be entertained, and end up hitting my head against a brick wall, going off and reading a book or something. So I think at the end of the day...
reading a book is good for you.
Absolutely. So I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the quality and the calibre of that program. And inextricably linked to that is the quality of journalists that SBS has always managed to attract. And again, I think one of our concerns is that the proposed changes don't in any way result in a loss of that really valuable skill that has been part of the SBS journalism and technical side of things since its inception, really. So I think when we talk about those safeguards, it's also about wanting at all costs to retain those really good journalists that have affiliated themselves with SBS. We don't want to lose those people. And again, they're the ones that drive that quality programming. So I think we need to be very, very careful that we don't inadvertently create a loss that we may not be able to replenish in the future.
So just to finish up, as a hypothetical question, if the government had decided not to cut SBS funding, but had decided that on top of that, SBS could supplement its funding further by having advertising along these lines to raise the sort of money we're talking about here to further improve its programming or its audience reach, would you have supported that?
Well, again, we would have taken that back to our constituency. So that's a very difficult one to answer categorically. But again, we can only, as issues come along, we can only try and assess them as they present themselves. And we would have been delighted if the funding cut hadn't occurred and SBS was allowed to retain the funding that it had. I mean, SBS over the years, it's not the first time it's gone through funding cuts. My brother worked for SBS when the first really big funding cut hit. And if I can just share a personal observance, my brother was a graduate of the Australian Film and Television School and came out of that being offered a number of different positions within media and television. And as the son of Greek immigrants and feeling that passion and that commitment as much as I do and we all do at Fecca, he chose to work for SBS and he was part of that family and he referred to it as his family for over a decade. And when those first really serious cuts hit, he and a lot of other people were let go of, and it was incredibly sad to see this because he had learnt so much and contributed so much. And he wasn't alone, there were a number of them, and there was this complete drain of that talent and that skill. And it was just very, very unfortunate. So it's not the first time that SBS has had to deal with this kind of situation, and it's, soldiered on and regrouped and come back. But there's a point where, it won't be able to do that indefinitely. And while we certainly recognise that the increase in the increase in advertising overall over a 24-hour viewing cycle isn't, the total number of viewing or advertising time isn't changing. That block of, primary viewing time between 6 and midnight, there will be increases in advertising, and it will be important to see how a number of things are impacted upon that we've already covered. But yeah, look, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I guess we would always go back to our constituency and see. Obviously, it wouldn't be as difficult an issue to deal with if that had been the scenario, which unfortunately it isn't.
Well, thank you very much for your submission and for being here today and providing evidence. Can I now call to the table representatives of SAVA SBS?